Okay, so I was telling you last time that in ordinary language, or what I like to call natural language, sometimes there are arguments embedded in the language, and some of those arguments are deductive arguments. So as critical thinkers, what we're called upon to do is to extract the deductive argument from the richness of natural language. And that takes some practice. Now, there are no specific rules to do that. You have to think and you have to make sense of the language that you're listening to or reading. So that's the main thing. You have to try to understand what the person is saying in the context. So that's the first thing you want to do. Then you want to determine whether or not there might be the possibility of a deductive argument being embedded in that language. If there is, then you want to engage in this process of translating the passage into standard form categorical syllogism. Okay, so we've been working so far with the syllogism almost in standard form, but in everyday activities, when you're really in the real world and listening to people talk or reading people's arguments, they're embedded in the richness of language. So when you extract these deductive arguments from natural language, you're going to lose a lot of meaning. But logicians do that on purpose. What we lose in meaning, what we gain is logical precision. So they know they're losing some of the meaning of the language, but they're extracting just the logical structure of the language so that they can make a determination whether or not the reasoning process is correct or incorrect. Remember, validity has to do with deductive arguments only, and what we're determining is whether or not the argument is, the reasoning process is correct. If it's correct, what that means is the premises are actually supporting the conclusion, and the conclusion follows with absolute necessity from the premises. Or another way of saying it is, if you assume the premises to be true, then the conclusion has to also be true. So that's the beauty of deductive arguments. You're drawing forth a truth from an already established truth. Well, chapter 7 in Copy's book deals mostly with translating arguments from ordinary language to standard forms. Let's see what the title of that chapter was, because it does more than that. But that's all I'm going to have you do, actually. Chapter 7. Syllogisms in ordinary language, that's what he calls it. So what we're going to deal with is 7.1, 7.2, 7.3, 7.4. And then we're going to skip, that's enough for this exam. And then we're going to go back and pick up 7.7 and 7.8 for part 2 of the course. And also we're going to go back to, in part 2 of the course, and we're going to transform, we're going to invert chapter 7. I'll explain that in a minute. So, so what's the first thing to do then when you're listening, when you're engaging in critical thinking? You want to make sense of what somebody's saying. That's the main thing. It's just pure reading comprehension or listening comprehension. That's called comprehension. And we make sense of things in the context. Okay, then you try to understand it. Then you try to gravitate towards what this person is claiming. What's the claim? Because if they're not claiming anything, then it's not an argument. Remember, there's a difference between explanations. You know, language can be used just to show the beauty of things. And that's not an argument. Usually, argumentative language, and that doesn't mean that you're arguing, it just means that you're presenting claims that are being supported by premises. Usually that's connected with deliberative discourse, like the political sphere, or whenever you're making a decision about something, or whenever you have to convince someone or persuade someone to take this kind of action or to think in this way, to accept this idea. If you think about how persuasive language is, it's quite ubiquitous. I mean, most of our language right now, in fact, I'm persuading you to realize how common persuasive language is. If you think about persuasive language, it pervades our language pretty much. But language can be used for other things too, just to show the beauty of things or to explain things, or all kinds of reasons. But a big part of language is argumentative in the neutral sense, that it's providing a claim being supported. And some of these arguments are deductive. Okay, so first thing to do is just try to understand what's being said. That's going to help a lot, because if you try to apply certain methods mechanically, you get into all kinds of trouble because you're not understanding what's being said. So that's very important. Copy does say that, but I want to underscore that even more. Okay, so the next thing to do is find the claim. What is the conclusion? Okay, what is this person trying to get me to accept, to take up this course of action, or to think in this way, whatever? Well, the next thing then is to reduce the number of terms to 3, because we know that a syllogism has only 3 terms. There's a subject term, a predicate term, and a middle term. The subject and predicate term both exist in the conclusion. There's no middle term in the conclusion. And in the major premise, the premise that comes first, there's a middle term and a predicate term of the conclusion. In the minor premise, there's the subject term and a middle term. So we're trying to get it into standard form. So we have to make 3 terms. Now, sometimes there are not 3 terms. If there are not 3 terms, then we can't reduce it to a syllogism. But it may look like there's not 3 terms, and there are 3 terms. So what you do is look for synonyms. It's good to know about synonyms, because when you're writing or when you're speaking, sometimes you don't want to use the same word over and over again. And synonyms, they're not the exact same word, but they mean pretty much the same thing, but there's a subtle difference. So the more synonyms you know, the more rich your linguistics expression is, because each word has slightly different nuances. You know the word nuance? That's a beautiful French word. It means, it's come into our English language, it means there's a subtlety about the word. Or it doesn't have to be even language, it can be feelings, or it can be anything. But nuance is a beautiful word. So each word has its own nuance. But like I said, when we translate from ordinary language to standard form, you lose this nuance. But we do that deliberately as logicians, as critical thinkers, because we want to put it in standard form so we can look at the reasoning process to see if it's correct. Okay, so you want to use your knowledge of synonyms. If they mean basically the same thing, of course there's going to be slight differences. If they mean basically the same thing, then you can use just, you want to reduce the words, the categories to 3. Okay, so you do that by way of synonyms. Like the example Copy gives on page 225, no wealthy persons are vagrants. That's the major premise of a syllogism. All lawyers are rich people. Well, that's not basically true, right? But it doesn't matter about truth right now. We're just looking at the reasoning process. Therefore, no attorneys are tramps. So a tramp and a vagrant are basically the same thing. So that's why, so how do you cultivate your linguistic skills such that you know that a vagrant and a tramp is the same thing? You do that by reading and by listening. And when you read, just circle the words that you don't know, and then go back and look those words up. If you do that, you can circle with pencil. That way you don't have to mess up your book if you don't like doing that, with a pencil. And then when you're finished reading for that little session of reading, go back and look up those. It's easy with the computer now. You just Google it. In fact, you can have the whole English, Oxford English Dictionary on your screen if you want, which is like 37 volumes long. But you don't have to go that far. Just look up the word, and you increase your vocabulary that way. So, but the way you reduce it to 3 terms is to use synonyms, and then just take one word or one class, and then reduce all the other words that mean the same thing to that class. So you try to put it into 3 terms. And Copy has exercises on that. I would work some of those. Look at the example on page 227. It's got a whole section on reducing it to 3 terms, but that's the gist of it. Use your knowledge of synonyms. Okay, then he comes up with 9 techniques or methods, and they're not rules to follow mechanically. So again, you have to go back and think. You have to use your, like I've been emphasizing, when you listen to someone, or when there's listening and there's listening. By that I mean there's careful listening. And when you read, there's reading and there's reading. You could read in a cursory way, like speed read, just pick up, and then you can go very, very carefully through. But the key to understanding anything is context. Language takes on meaning in context. It always okay, so that's an important thing. All right, so he comes up with these 9 methods or techniques, and they're not rules, but they help. And if you know these 9, it's going to be easier to translate from ordinary language to standard form. Well, one is called singular propositions. So sometimes, we're trying to get these, we're trying to make 3 propositions, right? We want to make a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. But sometimes in ordinary language or in natural language, people use just one class, a unit class, it's called. There's only one member in the class, like Socrates, Socrates is a philosopher. So how do you translate that into an A, an E, an I, or an O proposition? Well, there's only one person that makes up that whole class, namely Socrates. So Socrates is the subject of that sentence. If I say Socrates is a philosopher, philosopher is the predicate. So that translates into all Socrates is a person who is a philosopher. Okay. You take the unit class, and that if I say, well, what's another example? This table is not an antique. This table is not an antique. So that turns into all this table is a non-antique. Okay, so those are called unit classes. So that's pretty straightforward. You can read on page 229, 230. Trying to come up with another example here. Okay, so that's the first little rule he gives. You want to look for singular propositions that represent a whole class. Like, okay, so that's enough of that. Okay, another rule is sometimes they're just adjectival phrases or adverbial phrases, like flowers are beautiful. So beautiful is an adjective. It's not a class. So you have to turn it into beautiful things. Make it you make things, that's called uniform translation. You try to make adjectival phrases or adverbial phrases into classes. Okay. Dogs have keen sense of smell. So that turns into all dogs have keen senses of smell. Now I'm trying to come up with, well, let's go back to let's go back to the flowers are beautiful. If I say flowers are beautiful, the word beautiful is an adjective, so it's not a class. So you have to turn it into beautiful things. Let's think of a adverbial class. No warships are available for active duty. So available for active duty is an adverbial phrase. So you translate that into a thing available for active duty. So you're twisting language around, and you're not going to express this to anybody, so you don't have to worry about losing the meaning. This is just the reasoning process that goes into critical thinking. So, I wouldn't balk about, losing this meaning. So the point is, you take adjectival phrases or adverbial phrases and turn them into classes. Okay, and that's how you do that. So adverbial phrases or adjectival phrases designate attributes, but we take those attributes. Every attribute presupposes a class to which that attribute belongs. So we want to put that class there to make it into something. Okay, the third one, sometimes we've already touched upon this, but when you're listening to someone speak or reading someone's argument, they don't always use the verb to be. It could be any verb, but all verbs, if I say John runs fast, what that means is John is a person who can run fast. So is presupposed by run. Every verb, whatever the verb is, presupposes the verb to be. So when we translate from ordinary language to standard form, we just drop the verb and we turn it into some form of the verb to be. Usually they use the word are if it's plural and is if it's singular. By the time you get to the symbolic abbreviated form, just use the word is. That's called the copula. And so you take any verb and turn it into is or are. So that's that. All people seek recognition, for example. Some people drink Greek wine. So some people are people who drink Greek wine. So you want to make two terms and a copula between. And you want to keep those terms the same. Subject term, make it into something and then leave it at that. So when the subject term appears again, it's exactly the same. That's called uniform translation, okay? So you try to reduce it to three terms and then keep those three terms the same. They can't be different. That's important. Okay. Okay, the fourth rule, it's not really a rule, it's a sort of a method. Sometimes the subject and predicate are not in standard form. The example Copy gives, two examples are racehorses are thoroughbreds and all is well that ends well. So the first one, racehorses are thoroughbreds. That means all racehorses are thoroughbreds. That's a true statement. I mean, you can't be a racehorse unless with the certain kinds of races, unless it's a thoroughbred. So that's an easy one. All racehorses. If I say racehorses are thoroughbreds, it means all. But if I say all is well that ends well, then think about this example. What that means is all things that end well are well. That's a good example of what I said earlier. You just can't apply these like they're rules. You have to think about what they mean. All things that end well are things that are well. If I say all's well that ends well, okay, so I have to reverse the subject and predicate around in that case. Okay, now number 5, categorical propositions whose quantities are indicated by words other than standard form quantifiers. What are the standard form quantifiers? Remember, there's only 2 quantities, universal and particular. So, and there's 2 qualities, affirmative and negative, right? So all, no, and some, those are the quantifiers. All, S is P, that's universal and it's affirmative. No S is P, it's universal and it's negative. Some S is P is affirmative, and some S is not P. Some is not. The some is not, that's a quantifier. Also. The some is the quantifier. The not is the qualifier. Okay, so sometimes when you're listening in ordinary language or reading, you don't see these words, all, no, or some. But you have to think and reduce it to either all, no, or some. You know, think about what we're doing. We're trying to make it into a standard form categorical proposition. So what we're trying to do is bracket all the subtleties and the nuances of the meaning and just try to get it into standard form. Even though we lose the meaning, we're getting the logical structure. And that's what we're trying to extract the logical structure of these arguments that are embedded in natural language. So you just have to use your understanding of the meaning of the context. Let's see what Copy says. Statements beginning with words every and any, they're easily, right? Every dog has its day. You know, that means, well, it depends on the context. That could mean every person is going to get what they deserve. Usually that's what that means. Every dog has its day. When people say that, it really means every person. It's not talking about dogs. So it depends on the context again. But usually that's what that means. So that's an easy one. Every and any, they turn into all. Or every dog has its day would turn into all dogs are creatures that have their day. So we are creatures that have their day. All dogs is the subject, are, that's the copula, creatures that have their day. That's the predicate. But it depends on the context. If you say that in a speech and you're trying to show that there's instant karma for people who behave badly and they're going to get it someday, because what goes around comes around, then it doesn't mean dogs. It's a metaphor. So you have to, but that's not where we're not moving that direction. We're moving the other direction. So we're moving from ordinary language to standard form. So sometimes you're not seeing words like all, no, and some, but you have to reduce it to that. If you see everything and anything, or anyone, whoever, whosoever, these words, they shouldn't provide too much difficulty. Now, the grammatical particles like and an, those are called indefinite articles. And then that's called the definite article. So those words have to be reduced to the context. Sometimes they mean some, sometimes they mean all or no. You have to reduce it back to the context. If I say an elephant is a pachyderm, then I mean all elephants are pachyderm. If I say the whale is a mammal, it turns into all whales are mammals. Okay, the key there is context again. The definite article or the indefinite article, and, those are indefinite articles, and that's a definite article. They can mean some and they can mean all. It depends on the context, and you have to read it in context. Now this one is a little bit more complicated, the sixth method. Sometimes they're exclusive propositions. Like, sometimes it's good to memorize examples. I told you that helped me a lot to get through college. If you memorize an example and associate the example with a particular theory, or in this case, method, then you could just go back to that example. Like if I say only citizens can vote, or if I say none but the brave deserve the fair. But let's just keep it simple and let's just think about this and memorize this example. Only citizens can vote. Quite simple. So what you do is all those people who can vote are citizens. That's what that turns into. So if you see only or none but, if you think about the word only, it means none but, if you think about it. You know, only citizens can vote. That means all those people who can vote are citizens. So there's a kind of method you can follow. You just reverse the subject and predicate terms around and turn it into a universal proposition. Okay? So just remember that example. Only citizens can vote. That means all those people who can vote, that's your subject, are people who are citizens. Okay? So you just reverse. If you see none but or only, then reverse, change the subject and predicate terms around and turn it into a universal proposition. Reverse the subject and predicate and replace the word only with all. So only S is P turns into all S is P, or none but S is P turns into all P is S. Okay. Now sometimes in the seventh rule, sometimes there are passages that contain no words that indicate quantities. And again, you have to go back to context there. If I say dogs are carnivorous, I mean all dogs are carnivorous. But if I say children are present, I don't mean all children are present. That's a good example of context, right? If somebody says something a little bawdy or vulgar, and I look around and say, children are present. So do I mean all children are present? No, some children are present. So again, you have to think about the context. There are propositions that do not resemble standard form categorical propositions, but can be translated into those. Yeah, that's number 8. Let's see what Copy says here. Some examples are, not all children believe in Santa Claus, or there are white elephants. There are no pink elephants. Nothing is both round and square. So what does he say about that? On reflection, he goes on, he says, on reflection, these propositions will be seen to be logically equivalent to, and therefore to translate into. So we're looking for logical equivalence. And you're losing meaning. Okay, and so we can translate them into, some children are not believers in Santa Claus. If I say not all children believe in Santa Claus, that turns into some. See, that's counterintuitive. That's why you got to think. But if you think about what that means, I guess the way I would do it, you read a passage and then you try to think about what it means. And then ask yourself, is it an A, an E, an I, or an O proposition? If I say not all children believe in Santa Claus, well, I think to myself, what does that mean? Some children believe in Santa Claus. Some don't believe in Santa Claus. Not all believe in Santa Claus, but that means some believe in Santa Claus. So what does it mean? No, does it, try all four. Does it mean all children believe in Santa Claus? No. Does it mean um, no child believes in Santa Claus? No. It means some children believe in Santa Claus. What about that fourth possibility, the O proposition? Some children do not believe in Santa Claus. I guess it implies that also, but that's not really the intent of the statement. If I say some children, not all children believe in Santa Claus. Now I'm thinking, does it mean some children do not? Yeah, I would say, I don't know. I think I disagree with Kopi on this one because he claims that that statement means some children. But now that I think about it, it's really saying some children do not believe in Santa Claus. Some children are children who do not believe in Santa Claus. So in that case, see, it's not so black and white, right? So here's a point where Kopi and I have a slight difference. Probably if I were grading it, and if you said it means an I proposition, some children believe in Santa Claus. It depends on the context, I guess, whether it's an I or an O. If I say not all children believe in Santa Claus, in the context, it could mean some children do not believe in Santa Claus. Some children are not believers. No, we do agree. I had it wrong. No, we agree. He says it means some children are not believers in Santa Claus. So it turns into an old proposition. I thought so. I read it too quickly, and I thought he said it meant a I proposition, and then I start thinking about it, and I think no, it means an O proposition, and then I checked just now, it doesn't mean O. So, okay, the ninth little method he gives for translating from ordinary language to standard form, I'm going to bracket that, and I'm not going to. You're not responsible for that because it's too complicated. I mean, I want to do other things, so I don't want you wasting your efforts on that. But basically, if they're acceptive propositions, like for example, not all employees are eligible, that makes two propositions. It means all non-employees are eligible, and no employee is eligible. So it turns into two. So, but then that complicates everything when you're trying to make a syllogism. So let's not worry about the ninth one. I won't put anything like that on the test. All right, so the way this is going to work, the way this works for critical thinking. Now, here's my theory. I mean, for critical thinking, this is what we're working on now. This is the last phase of part one of this course. And remember, part one of the course is all about critical thinking. What is critical thinking? Making a judgment or an evaluation about someone else's argument. You're not inventing any argument. You're just being able to determine whether or not that argument is valid or invalid. If it's deductive argument. If it's inductive, and we haven't been studying that, it's either highly probable or not so probable. And we're looking at only if it's valid with classical deductive logic. There's another kind of deductive logic too, symbolic logic. We're not dealing with that here. We're doing classical deductive logic. If it's valid, that means the reasoning process is correct. But the other aspect, which is equally important, is to determine whether or not the syllogism is sound. Okay, we talked about this. For it to be sound, it has to be valid. That's what we're working on, validity. But it also, the premises and the conclusion have to all be true. And then the question of truth is a big question. It's a big philosophical question. It's one that's in the air today because truth is under attack. And if it gets to a point where there is no belief in truth, then good luck to the human race, because anything is permitted. Anyone can, then might makes right. Whoever has the biggest power is true, is right. So this is a big question. But for now, I think it's correct to say that truth is, a proposition is true when it corresponds to reality. Now, of course, that brings up big questions about what is reality, how can there be correspondence, and these take us into deep metaphysical thinking, which is beyond this course. But a good, working, correct definition of truth would be truth is correspondence. So when I say something, or when someone says something, and what they mean by what they say corresponds to reality, and a lot of times this can be checked, because people's expressions are perspectival, and everybody sees the world from their own perspective. But certain things can be checked, like water boils at a certain temperature or freezes at a certain temperature. Certain things can be checked. They come fact, they're facts, and so let's just use that definition of truth. But the test is not going to be about that. We're going to work only on translating from ordinary language to standard form, putting it into standard form, and then, well, let me go one more carefully. So the critical, critical thinking in my mind is you're listening or you're reading somebody else's arguments, and you're trying to determine if it's a deductive argument or not, or what kind of argument, is it deductive or inductive? Okay, if it's deductive, then we try to translate it into standard form and then test to see if it's valid or not. That's what we're going to be doing. If it's valid, that's good. That means the premise supports the conclusion. But now we have to look at the premises and the conclusion, ask ourselves if those propositions are true. Now, how do you know if it's true or not? Well, that's going to depend on your education and on your good sense. So that's why a liberal arts education is so important. It's not just your formal education either. It's observing life, learning from your mistakes, watching people, watching things unfold, thinking about experience. Some people, they say, well, you don't need book learning, you need experience. Other people say, you need to study and, just live in your ivory tower. You don't need experience. What you need is thoughtful experience. You need both. So there's no reason to, that's a false dilemma. You don't have to become a bookworm and forget about the world, or you don't have to become a man or a woman of action and forget about learning. A lot of people do that. There's anti-intellectualism in the world where they say you don't need book learning. Look how much money I made. I never went to school. Well, it's not all about making money. So whether or not propositions are true or not, that's based on your education and your good sense. And you get that from studying and from thoughtful experience, okay? So that's why education is so important. But that's not what we're dealing with here. I'm just trying to help you to learn that part of critical thinking that has to do with judging whether or not arguments are valid or not. And for that, there are 3 techniques. All right, so the whole process is translation from ordinary language to standard form, categorical syllogism, using these methods that I just went over. Then take another step towards form. You know what I mean when I say that? I mean, you're moving away from content into form. Like if I say, Socrates is a philosopher. Okay, that's a proposition, so it's pretty formal, but it's got content in there, namely Socrates and philosopher. So if I say, all Socrates is a philosopher, now I'm moving away from the meaning of that sentence, but I'm trying to get it closer to standard form. But if I say, all S is P, now S represents the subject, which is Socrates, P represents philosopher, but I'm not talking about, I didn't say Socrates or philosopher, I just says all S is P. So now I'm moving towards form. Okay, form the opposite of form is content. So what we're doing is moving away from content and towards form. Okay? And the reason we're doing that is so we can see the logical structure of arguments. So that way we can determine whether or not it's valid or invalid. But we're not going to express ourselves that way. So the whole picture is this. You're listening to someone's talking, you're reading something, or you're reading something, and then we're going to try to extract it and turn it into standard form categorical syllogisms, one at a time. Sometimes they make a chain where one conclusion becomes the premise of the next one, and it makes like a tight chain. That's called a sorority. By the way, I'm going to ask you, we're not going to worry about enthymemes and sorites. It's a little bit complicated, and I want to do other things in this class, so we're not going to deal with those parts of chapter 7. Then you translate it into standard form categorical syllogism. Then take another step. I'm calling it abbreviated symbolic form. Like, by that I mean, instead of saying all Socrates is a philosopher, I say all S is P. I want you to take that step because the more you can move away from content and towards form, the easier it will be to manipulate the logical structure of things. Believe me, it is, because what happens is if the content is still there, your mind goes to the content and then you can't concentrate on the form. But what we're dealing with is the form. So the more content is there, the more it just gets in the way. So we want to try to bracket content. You want to get it all down into like AAA1 or EAO2. You know, that's the most formal thing. Like if I, AAA1, I mean, it's a all M is S, all M is P, all S is M, therefore all S is P. So that's an AAA1. And then the content is bracketed. Then there's 3 methods of testing the validity of syllogisms. One is the Venn diagram technique. That's the one that shows the most visually. The other one is the rules. And the third one is the coined name method. Usually teachers don't teach all 3, but I'm really trying to get you to master the syllogism because I want you to master that so that you can turn that into a tool to actually constructing arguments. So I want you to do all 3, but they're not really, they all are quite telling. So the theory behind the Venn diagrams is, and I've said this already, but it's worth repeating. You take the 2 premises and you diagram them. And remember, always diagram the universal premise first. Even though it may be the minor premise, if I have some S is P or some M is S some M is P in the major premise, and the minor premise says no S is M, then I have to diagram the minor premise first because the minor premise is universal. Remember, A and E propositions are universal. So if you don't diagram those first, then it messes up the whole process. I told you that's how I made my mistake in my first course in logic and ended up with a C on the test or something. Okay, so I won't make that mistake again. So always translate the universal proposition first. So the theory behind this is that if you diagram the major and minor premise, and then you look to the conclusion, if the conclusion's already diagrammed, remember, after you diagram the major and minor premise, you don't do any more diagramming. Then you look to the conclusion. Is the conclusion diagrammed already? Now you got to see what that means. You have to understand what that means by working problems and seeing. If it's already diagrammed, then it's valid. If it's not, it's invalid. Okay, so I'm going to ask you for the test. If it is valid, then just go through those 15 names. Usually I had people memorize those names, but since it's open book, they're right there in front of you. There are 4 names that go with figure 1, 4 names. The vowels of those names represent the mood of that syllogism. So there are 4 for figure 1, 4 for figure 2, 4 for figure 3, 3 for figure 4. There's 15 valid syllogisms, like Barbara, AAA1. Just name the name. that it corresponds to, if it's valid. But I want you to do the Venn diagram and indicate whether or not it's valid or invalid. So what I'm asking for is a standard form categorical syllogism, then an abbreviated form of that with just all SSP, no SSP, therefore whatever. And then name its figure and its mood, and then draw the 3 circles and test it by means of the Venn diagram. If it's valid, name the name that it corresponds to. But there's one little step before all that, is what we were just dealing with now, translating. And I kept it quite simple. Actually, I put 5 questions there on your test. Work the last ones first, they're easier. I should have put those first. I should have made it easier to hard. The first ones are a little harder. So do the last ones first and you'll get more confidence. I should have switched them around, but the number 5 and 4 are a lot easier. Do those first and then go back to those others. But I didn't make it real hard. But I wanted you to deal with this because we're going to invert that. That's what I want to talk about now, but I just want to make sure you're clear about this process. So basically what I did is I made a test that is comprehensive, that it presupposes everything we've been doing up to this point. Okay, because I want to consolidate because otherwise, you don't see the forest for the trees, as they say. I want you to see the big picture. The big picture is to cultivate your critical thinking process. So how's it work? You go from ordinary language, standard form, abbreviated standard form, test the validity. If it's valid, then ask yourself, is it sound? If it's sound, what does that mean? It means it's valid and all the premises and the conclusions are true. And if you do that slowly with books and the written word and so on, what happens is you're cultivating your critical skills. And when it happens that you need to actually make a judgment about other people's arguments and evaluating their arguments, you'll be able to do that. That's so important for a democratic republic. I mean, if you think about it, democracy means the rule of the people. Demos means people. And republic means a people thing. That's what the word means literally. So our government is based on, it's supposed to be of the people, for the people, by the people. They really emphasize the people thing. That's what the very word res publica means, people thing. It's a republic. So if you have a populace that's unable to think critically, then anybody can take over the government and no one will know the difference. And then they can call it a democratic republic, call it anything you want, but it's fascism, is what it really is. So this is so important. In fact, right at the beginning of the book, Thomas Jefferson, who was the main, he's the main person, it's a beautiful quote. If it's right at the beginning of this book, of your copy book. In a republican nation, whose citizens are to be led by persuasion and not by force, the art of reasoning becomes of the first importance. I think I'm going to change the name of this course to the art of reasoning rather than thinking. Thinking is something even bigger for me than reasoning. The art of reasoning. So this is what we're trying to, so if you take these steps in this painstaking way, painstaking, if you take these steps and do it in this way, you may think to yourself, well, I'm never going to actually listen to somebody's argument, translate it in standard form, use the validity. Maybe not. But what's happening is you're cultivating your critical skills so that when it does happen, you're better at it. It's sort of like in sports when you're doing, when I watch the soccer players and the lacrosse players doing those works with their footwork, going through the ladders and things like that. They're not going to think about where their feet are when they're engaged in some moment of lacrosse, but their feet are moving better now because of that practice. So that's how it works. All right, let me just say this one last thing now, and as preparation for part 2 of the course, as a transition, and then we'll focus on that. I sort of pushed my way through this because the course is moving quickly. We only have like 3 more weeks. So basically, what we're going to do is take chapter 7. See, there are only 15 valid syllogisms, right? So if you have those syllogisms in your mind and you know those 15 the moods and figures of those 15. That's why it would be good to memorize those 15 names that those monks came up with that correspond to the vowels of those names correspond to the mood. And then they just place them according to the correct figures. Then if you instantiate, now if you can move the other way, the second part of the course, instead of going from form to content, we're going to go from content to form, we're going from form to content. So you have this formal, you have an AAA1, for example. All M is P, all S is M, therefore all S is P. That's an AAA1, Barbara. If you know that, and if you can do that with all 15 syllogisms, if you can recite the names and figures of all 15 valid syllogisms, then when you're making a speech or when you're writing anything or when you're thinking, what you can do is make a claim, whatever it is you want to support. Like you have a thesis that you want to support. So now you make a claim that supports that thesis. Let's say I want to support the thesis that we should preserve the arts and music in the schools. And I'm the Secretary of Education or something like that, and I want to make a speech. So I could take that argument, that AAA1 that I know, and the conclusion is that music makes you smarter. So I know that supports my thesis, that we shouldn't get rid of music from the curriculum, even if we're under financial distress. So that's my thesis. We should preserve the arts in the curriculum, the core curriculum of our students. So now I know an AAA1 is valid. So all I have to do is instantiate that. All I got to do is get a conclusion. Okay, it's an A. All music makes you smarter. If I have my conclusion, I have my subject and my predicate term, and I know the form, if it's figure 1, 2, 3, or 4, then I have everything except the middle term. Now I have to use my ingenuity to try to figure out the middle term. Once that comes in place, I've seen the connection between the subject and predicate term. Now I can make a syllogism. Boom, I have it. And we worked with that AAA1 with music. All things that stimulate the corpus callosum make you smarter. Music stimulates the corpus callosum, therefore music makes you smarter. But I had to come up, when I was making that syllogism, I had to figure out that anything that stimulates the corpus callosum makes you smarter, and that music stimulates the corpus callosum. I had to see how the subject and predicate term combined. For that, I needed my ingenuity. Ingenuity is at the heart of deductive reasoning. That's my insight. Someday I'll write an essay on that, because it's counterintuitive. You never think that ingenuity is at the heart, but it never came up with logic, because logicians don't ever invent arguments. What we're going to do is actually invent arguments. So that's a little taste of what's coming, and that's a transition into part 2 of the course. And that's the exciting part, because we're using the other part of our brain, the creative part of our brain. And in life, you're going to be asked not to just evaluate other people's arguments. That's important to become a citizen, and like Thomas Jefferson was saying, not just for politics, but just for anything, just not to be duped, not to be persuaded by fallacious arguments. That's why I wanted you to learn about the fallacies too. But if you're in a leadership position, then you need to actually construct arguments. But leadership takes on all kinds of forms, and it goes all the way from just leading yourself through life, which is important. That's leadership too. But the more responsibilities you get in life, the more you need to possess practical wisdom. And the expression of practical wisdom is eloquence. So we're going to, our movement now is going to be from valid form. We have 15 valid syllogisms, and we have other techniques we've learned along the way. And we need to go, next time we need to go through immediate inferences. I'll show you how. We'll go back to chapter, I think it's chapter 5. We need to go back to chapter 5 and learn how to make immediate inferences. That's why I'm sort of pushing forward, because the reason I waited on that is because that's really a form of inventing arguments. You're generating another inference based on a conclusion. So we'll work on that. But we're going to move now into that creative part of the mind where you learn how to construct arguments. We're going to take these principles and methods used to determine correct from incorrect reasoning. We're going to transform those into tools that we can use to construct arguments. Okay. All right. Thank you.